In this video, we are going to look at one of the biggest influences on the French Revolution, which was France's kings. But we're not actually going to look that much at the king during the Revolution, but the kings prior to the Revolution. You'll hear a lot in history. You need to understand the past to understand the future. This is absolutely a case of it. So we're going to backtrack a bit in the historical record, but we need to do this so we can understand where France was both politically and financially before the French Revolution, because both of those played a huge role. So we are going to roll back to Louis XIV, who you probably would know most well as being the king involved in the Three Musketeers. Louis XIV is one of the biggest, most dramatic, and most flamboyant figures in European history. He is known as the Sun King, as in the sun never sets upon his reign. Oftentimes you'll see him styled as Louis XIV. XIV is 14th in Roman numerals, which we often use to keep track of our rulers. Louis was an absolute monarch and believed himself to be an absolute power. France did have very convoluted ways in which the king was not quite the absolute monarch that we think of, so put an asterisk next to that, but for all intents and purposes, Louis XIV was that absolute monarch, and he actually managed to consolidate a huge amount of both actual power but also influence under his control over the nobility and the political system. He styled himself as the Sun King because he was the sun around the which the kingdom rotates, and he very famously said, "I am the state." He is probably the single most powerful ruler in Europe in the 17th century. And yes, I just said 17th century. We're talking 1600s here, because he reigned from 1643 to 1715. He took the throne literally as a child and then reigned for 70 years almost. It's one of the longest reigns in world history whatsoever. He waged many wars throughout his reign, and while those were successful and they actually brought him quite a bit of fame and fortune, they're also expensive. And the reason he fought so many wars is because France is a powerful nation at this time, and other European nations, kingdoms really at this point, not nations, other countries in Europe could see that they needed to somehow put a check on this guy's power, and they just could not. So he was extremely successful militarily. However, that military victory comes at a monetary cost. And as we'll see, it's not a monetary cost that Louis XIV would end up paying. He also is extremely famous for having built the Chateau Versailles. And Versailles was a giant hunting palace. It's a hunting lodge that Louis converted into a palace because he hated living in Paris, but as well, he wanted to force the other nobles to have to come to attend to him. One of the checks on the French king's power prior to Louis XIV was that he had to balance all of the powers of the nobilities, and the nobility would be in control of these local areas. So he had to make deals and work with people in order to get stuff done. But what Louis XIV did is he forced the nobility to come stay with him at Versailles. And what he was doing was he was distancing the nobles from their local power bases, ensuring that they couldn't build up support from themselves on their land. Instead, they had to come and hang out with Louis, and he actually manipulated them so well that they would end up squabbling with one another for things like being able to sit at Louis' side at dinner or being able to attend to him as he woke up in the morning, as opposed to building their own power bases in order to compete with Louis. Versailles was super important because of this. It was also extremely expensive. And it might seem like I'm really emphasizing money here. I am really emphasizing money here because while Louis XIV is known for being this grand spectacle of a king, spectacle comes at a cost. And I bet you can see where this is going. So Louis absolutely refused to compromise on his vision for Versailles, and because he was just this powerful and this charismatic, Louis got what he wanted. There was no way around it. He was getting what he wanted. So he would do things like have gardeners move fully grown trees to Versailles rather than waiting for them to grow. Might not seem like a big deal to us looking at it several hundred years later, but we have industrialized machines that are designed to do that. This is not a period when people have, like, you are literally using horsepower to do that. Not horsepower in a car, actual horses. It's an immense amount of energy and time and work. And yes, it's an immense amount of money. So when Louis was a child, a large reason why he wanted to break the nobles' power is because France had experienced civil wars when he was a kid. And to ensure that they couldn't raise armies to oppose the king, Louis was forcing everyone to come to Versailles, at least his court and the important nobles, so that they would be broken from their power bases and he could keep an eye on them. He was really good at playing that particular game. So the nobles ended up competing with one another to seem important to the king rather than trying to depose the king or take over. So Louis basically left France bankrupt. The kingdom had a substantial debt upon his death. All of his direct heirs died prematurely, so when Louis XIV died, it passed down to his great-grandson, whose name was Louis XV, and much like Louis XIV, Louis XV inherited the kingdom as a small child. Side note as well, so did Louis XIII. France had 3 kings in a row inherit the kingdom as a little kid. So Louis XV reigned France from 1715 to 1774. Not nearly as long as Louis XIV, but still a very good run. Louis also ended up, or Louis XV, because if I just say Louis, this gets incredibly confusing. Louis XV also ended up waging wars during his campaign or during his reign. However, these were not nearly as successful as Louis XIV's. So he had several military losses. Much of the French territory ended up going over to Spain and to Britain. And particularly, we're talking about New France here. If you're paying attention to your Canadian history, yes, this is the point in the Seven Years' War when Canada falls, or what will become Canada, falls under the British control. Louis was also a source of scandal. He was known to have several mistresses, to frequently cheat on his wife, to throw extravagant parties. So, in a very Catholic dominated country, people questioned, well, how can this be God's appointed king? Because that was the belief at the time, that kings were divinely ordained. And the thing that really ticked the French people off about Louis XV was that the French at the time had a very strong rivalry with the Austrians, but Louis, in an attempt to solidify peace between France and Austria, married his grandson, the future Louis XVI, to Marie Antoinette of Austria. And this was actually fairly common, that you would use marriage as a way of cementing a peace, of being a political alliance. But it was unpopular amongst the French because they didn't want to have the bloodline married to the Austrians. They didn't want to be involved with the Austrians. And it was also not a super successful marriage. There was not a lot of chemistry between Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and they were very physically distant for a very long time as well. So, both politically and romantically, it was a very rough match. And it actually led to assassination attempts on Louis XV. It was extremely unpopular. So, between those costly wars and the decadent lifestyle, uh, Louis XV left France even more in debt than they had been because of Louis XIV, and it left the country deeply divided and frustrated, which kind of sets our stage for a revolution to get rolling.